Good morning, everyone. My name is Avesta Hojjati. I'm the head of R&D at DigiCert. For those of you who are not familiar with DigiCert, historically we are a certificate authority. So certificates that exist on every single phone that you have here, or majority of the SSL handshakes that you make to your web servers and the browsers is actually provided by DigiCert. The overview of the talk today will be in regards to the threat of unauthorized access. We will give you some background of what that unauthorized access means. The threat of invalid identity. We will describe a little bit of quantum supremacy and what does that really mean for blockchain. Who is ready for this threats that we are discussing? What is the DigiCert's approach and industry's approach specifically? As I mentioned, we are a CA and we are the only CA so far who has worked on blockchain. We describe what is public key infrastructure and what we are doing in regards to Hyperledger Fabric, and that will wrap up the talk today. I know the presentation for is 40 minutes. I try to wrap it up a little bit faster than that, so if there's any questions, I'll be happy to discuss those. Before we get into blockchain, let's get to something else that everybody else is way more familiar with, and we always hear those terminologies, and that is IoT. We are surrounded by these devices, and recently have done some survey, and the survey is mentioning that the importance of IoT to different businesses, and 90% of them were mentioning that as important. And this is different type of businesses: healthcare, manufacturing, car manufacturers, even the aerospace has the same scenario. So what is important to understand is the top priorities of the surveys when it comes to the IoT providers, and increasing the operational efficiency is something that IoT provides to them. If I do have sensors deployed everywhere on my manufacturing plants, I'm able to actually have a better reading of what device is not functioning properly, and then I'll be able to optimize that. For some customers, enhancing the customer experience is another scenario. If I do have an IoT device that is able to actually read some of the data from a household, would I be able to actually optimize their household setup? And then obviously growing revenue is something that everybody is looking forward to. So giving all the scenarios, these are the priorities that IoT has. And what I would really like for us to think about is what will be the priorities for an individual or an entity who's going to deploy blockchain. But then what would be the security cost of those? An example in the survey again that we ran for IoT, 8 out of 10 businesses reporting that security as their top concern for IoT. But how often have we heard that security is a concern for blockchain deployments? Right? You're saying that auditability, transparency, and visibility within the data that we are adding is quite important. But where security actually leads down? Going back to the example of Bitcoin, it was a permissionless blockchain, and we saw some abuse of the platform. If many of you guys remember, Silk Road back in the day was a platform that allowed people to actually go ahead and buy drugs. And they were buying drugs online utilizing a mean of payment that was able to actually protect their privacy. That mean of payment was Bitcoin. And nobody cared about the identity that was actually residing behind that purchase. So again, just preparing the mindsets here of what to think in regards to blockchain and how we're connecting that somewhat to the IoT. In addition to that, the percentage of companies that were experiencing incidents was quite high. About 69% of them were experiencing data breaches. This is IoT. Now think about the blockchain that evolves around data. Data is everywhere. So what happens if you don't have proper security when it comes to blockchain, and then we get some data breaches? Let's say you do have a permissionless blockchain platform, and then you're connecting it to the permission one as in your enterprise, and for some odd reason you have not done your permissions properly. Now the data will leak to the permissionless, and now that will be a disaster. So I would like to ask this question. Contrary to what you might think, these two circles are not the same, nor they are the equal size. How many of you think that the red one is the bigger one? How many of you think that the blue one is the bigger one? Fantastic. So I just lied to everyone. These are exactly the same size. What I'm trying to tell you is in regards to identity. How would I know that somebody on the internet actually does not provide the fake identity? How would I know that when I talk to my grandma in Australia, I really do talk to my grandma in Australia? Indeed, I can ask her some questions, some jokes that she told me when I was very young, or I can ask her about some events that she has taken place. But again, if there's somebody who's able to do some attacks, such as man in the middle, they're able to actually go ahead and learn those and come up with it. So identity is quite important. Interacting with valid identity is an important matter. But what is very important when it comes to blockchain is preserving those identities. If I put my identity online, is it any way for me to actually prove who I am without telling more information? Some of you might be familiar with the technology. This is possible with zero-knowledge proof or other type of approaches that exist. But that might be a little bit too complex for some folks to push out. So this is everybody's problem, but only few solutions are available. Validating identities for permission blockchain platforms requires a rigorous framework. So as a certificate authority, we do this on a daily basis. Whenever you go to your financial institute, you connect to them via SSL or TLS for the modern terminology, and usually connect to them via what we call an extended validation. This basically means we put them through a framework, we ask them that they prove to us that they're really that financial institute, they have been established, let's say in Switzerland, and they do have the proper means. And then we give them a certificate that has a different behavior. That's where you see the green bar on top of your browser. So are we able to actually do the same thing for blockchain? Well, the answer indeed is yes. What we can do is when it comes to the permission systems, you are able to validate those entities despite the fact that this is an enterprise and you're going to trust everyone, but we are able to increase that trust level. And later I will describe how we have done that in regards to this. So knowing who the person is, interacting with that individual and being able to, in some sense, preserving their privacy is quite important. The third problem that we are working on is quantum supremacy. How many of you guys have heard of quantum computers? Oh, fantastic. In Europe, everybody knows about quantum computers. That's great. So just the elevator's pitch of what a quantum computer is. Quantum computers are this new type of computers that are able to solve some problems in polynomial time instead of exponential time. Example of that is breaking an RSA algorithm. In classical computers, if you're going to break an RSA key, it's going to take you many, many years. But in quantum computers, it's going to take you maybe weeks. Example is breaking 400 bits of RSA requires only 1,000 qubits, and that will take you maybe a couple of seconds to break it. Now, what's the problem when it comes to blockchain? Majority of the algorithms that we are pushing to blockchain are only resistant to classical computers. So if you have a quantum computer and you have deployed this massive blockchain platform, there's a chance that we are able to break those algorithms once this quantum computers are out there. So we need to think about that problem as well. Identity, validation, and quantum computers. And again, some might argue that quantum computers will not be out in the next 5 or 10 years, and that is totally valid. But your blockchain platform is going to exist 20 years from now, and the data that you're going to put on that is going to reside for many years. So we would rather start the protection today. So when it comes to the idea of blockchain, there's 3 suggestions that we have as a security expert: validation and identity protection factory provider. And that is, regardless of being permissioned, permissionless, or hybrid model, there's a value of interacting with valid identities. I mentioned Silk Road, but you can consider that you're being companies like Walmart and you have a number of suppliers being part of your permission Hyperledger fabric, and you still want to know that who that farmer is who has provided that lettuce with E. coli. So this is an end-to-end identity for him. But that farmer doesn't necessarily want to tell you that who their real name is. All they have to do is that they have a valid identity. That's another example. Another portion of this is the reliable and scalable Pki infrastructure. If many of you have interacted with Hyperledger Fabric, indeed it does get shipped out with a Pki Modular. And we have actually taken that Pki Modular out and we are pushing a new Pki Modular in that, which allows you to create more scalability. Example of that is being able to push up to 20,000 certificates per second. And those certificates could be used for your transitions on the fabric, as well as the other entities are able to use them as an identifier. And then finally, easily encrypting all the data, and that comes down to the quantum supremacy portion of this. Is there any algorithm that we are able to use to actually encrypt the data and put them on the fabric or other permission blockchains and protect them for the next 5, 10, or 20 years? So what we have done at DigiCert, we have created an enhanced Pki Modular for permission frameworks that provide you with scalability, reliability, as well as accessibility. Today we have about 20 billion different IoT devices that are utilizing this platform. Therefore, we know it's scalable. That being said, the number of transactions that you're going to have on a Hyperledger fabric per se, or any other permission blockchains, is going to be probably 10 or 20 more times more than the IoT devices, because these transactions are happening more frequently than the transactions that IoT devices are making. So this is what you have on a Hyperledger fabric today. If you're familiar with deployment of it, this is the modular that you can deal with. I mentioned there's a fabric certificate authority being pushed out. And what we have done is we have kind of made this much smaller. We have pushed out to a much smaller Pki Modular provided by DigiCert that gives you 4 different functionalities. Functionality number 1 is validating the identity of every individual who's going to interact on that framework. Instead of being an organization, we are mentioning individuals. If you have an employee who would like to be on the fabric and interact with it, we will provide a remote mean of actually validating their identity and then pushing them on that platform. If you have an organization who would like to go through organization validation, we do the same process for them. The second portion of this is key management. That's usually is being kind of notion as a granted that nobody will look at it. But give you an example in the IoT scenario is that good amount of IoT devices that we are seeing right now are sharing private keys. And that is a problem, because if one of those IoT devices gets compromised, that means the entire product line of those IoT devices has been compromised. So what we are doing here is we are managing the private keys on Hyperledger, and we are doing that with a number of different ways. We are applying techniques such as multi-party computation to be able to actually distribute the private key between different entities who are existing on Hyperledger Fabric. And then if you don't require that type of security, we can apply something known as Shamir secret sharing. So we will just share that private key, and we don't need to any computation on it. The third factor of this is the distributed certificates with a high throughput. So today we do have certificates that we call short-lived certificates. These are certificates that are living for 30 or 90 days. But what would happen if I have an entity that is going to only interact on the Hyperledger Fabric for a matter of day? Do I need to waste a certificate for the next 29 days? That's not really feasible. So what we're providing here is a certificate that is a timely manner. You're able to issue a certificate to an employee or to an organization for a matter of days or hours, and they're able to interact with that certificate on the Hyperledger Fabric for that period. And then finally, we provide a management for this platform that includes, again, identity, proper algorithm, and then the certificate management. So that comes with our what we call Cert Central. If you're interested, I'll be happy to talk to you guys about this. This is available to be integrated to Hyperledger Fabric today. It's totally API-based. There's an SDK for it available as well. You're able to push it out to your production line, and we'll be happy to discuss that. So to authenticate or validate, that was the main question that came up for this talk. And the answer is you actually need to do both of those. You could have a valid identity, but if you're not properly authenticating to that identity, you haven't gained anything. You're just talking to an identity that you know has the rights to interact with you. And vice versa still applies. If you authenticate to an identity that has not been validated, you're just providing a mean of encryption. And basically, you can think about this as providing a secure line for malwares to be transmitted. Still they're using the encryption, but now you're interacting with a malicious actor on the other side. So properly applying these techniques will require area-specific expertise, and there are many different teams, researchers, and companies that are working on this. So there's an industry vision when it comes to this, and that is, one, this needs to be fully compatible with Hyperledger Fabric. We mentioned other ones, there's Sawtooth and Iroha, and there's a number of different ones that we are working on with, but Fabric is the main focus that we have seen. This will be developed for today and tomorrow. I can emphasize of how much work has gone through this quantum supremacy and quantum algorithms, or for short we call them PQC, post-quantum crypto. As well as this needs to be a personalized solution for every use case. One size fits all definitely does not apply to the scenario. You need to have the proper architecture when it comes to different sizes of deployment. So we mentioned that at the beginning of the talk, and when we started making the scene, that 92% of companies were saying that IoT is important for them. But 84% of those companies are saying that they're thinking about blockchain. The problem is 0% of those companies know about security on blockchain, nor they're interested to know about it, because they believe blockchain by its nature will provide security. And that is quite sad. The use cases that we have seen right now is in energy sector. A good amount of companies are looking forward to actually have a distributed model to be able to take a mean of payment from their customers across the United States where we are residing. The data generated by manufacturing machinery is another portion of this, and unfortunately, they never mention validation. They're only saying that there's an IoT device on my manufacturer floor. I'm going to distribute the data that has been generated and put it on the platform, and this essentially by itself is good enough for me. Given that there is protocols such as consensus that are able to actually protect the bad data to be uploaded. And we're completely arguing that because still there are ways for a permission system to have a manipulated consensus protocol to allow you to push the improper data. And then EHRs, electronic health records, is another scenario of that. Imagine that you have an entity that created a framework for a number of different hospitals, and there's a nurse in one hospital that does not have proper identity. They're able to come in, manipulate the data, and put it up there. So with that in mind, what needs to be carried away is industry leaders need to dedicate and enhance identity verification and authentication when it comes to permission or hybrid blockchain platforms. I'm putting the permissionless kind of aside because permissionless by itself is designed for people to actually utilize it without getting authenticated. Bitcoin was the greatest example of this. Everybody liked to be anonymous. It wasn't any need for a centralized place. And the promise kind of was that you don't need to show who you are if you would like to interact. And for some that worked out, but in the case of Silk Road, that was a disaster. United States, they were able to track, or FBI was able to track the transactions that they were taking place and essentially capture Ross, who was the owner of this website. So with that in mind, if there's any questions, I'll be happy to answer those. I didn't want to go really technical of what we are doing. Just wanted to mention that authentication and validation are extremely important. My name is Avesta. I'll be available for the next 2 days. So if you have any questions, I'll be happy to respond to this. Thanks. Sure.
So I know you said 92% of companies were interested in security, but my experience is most of the IoT devices out there, even though they say they're interested in security, they're not armed with the tools to really know what good security is. Everything from default, links to admin, default passwords to really bad pseudo-random number generators, et cetera, et cetera. So I guess it worries me even more that we have companies in IoT that don't know how to do security really well, and now they're going into blockchain, kind of exacerbating that model. What do you think, security professionals or even just software engineers that are aware of security can do to advocate for change within companies or within communities to make sure that they don't repeat the same mistakes?
My answer is going to be unfortunate. So I spend the majority of my time in academia. So I'm finishing my PhD at the University of Illinois. And what I do at work is completely different than what I do in academia. In academia, I actually attack devices to show that they're vulnerable. So medical devices is a good example of that. You mentioned username and password being the default, and that's what we have seen on medical devices. And these are devices that are plugged into humans. Now, consider that private data that I might have will follow the same scenario. It has been collected from me, it has been on the permissioned blockchain, but then there is a vulnerability, and that is there's no proper authentication. You have used a very weak algorithm to push that out. I said my answer is going to be unfortunate because the only way that you're able to promote that there's bad security is to actually show them that the vulnerability exists. And in the past, the way that I've seen that is to attack them, tell them that there's a vulnerability. If they don't respond, you get FCC, FDA, all those federal regulators involved. The problem is there's no proper regulation when it comes to blockchain. There's no FDA, there's no FCC. And maybe that's the proper way to do it. On the other hand, it's improper because your power kind of decreases. A company could come up with their blockchain platform and deploy it, and they could be vulnerable, let's say Marriott in US. But who's actually going to look at their permissioned setup? Who's going to look at their environment and development? So I think it takes a couple of headlines in newspaper that this person has used blockchain and they have been attacked, and this has been the result, and that could probably cause them to actually move towards a better model and start using a standard. And another portion of this is proper standards for blockchain. Hopefully in the next 2 days we will hear something about that, but there are no standards. Who's actually pushing for the right algorithm to be used? Who's actually pushing for a proper implementation of Byzantine fault tolerance? Because everybody can look at the algorithm, but not everybody is able to develop and push the consensus properly.
So your product for Hyperledger Fabric, is it just a replacement for their Fabric CA function?
It is. So there are a couple of problems with the CA function that gets pushed out. It's not scalable. We have tested this in the labs that we have. So number of 6 nodes is the largest one that you're able to have. And I mentioned nodes because the number of users that you're able to have is even less than that if you're going to do the proper validation and issuing proper PKC 11 certificates. So what we have done is we have grabbed that modular. As you know, Hyperledger Fabric is plug and play. We took that out and we push out to the scalable modular that we have. We have done this for the past 20 years. We know it works for a very high volume. But what is important here is the management part of that. It's very hard to manage the CA that gets shipped out with Hyperledger today. For us, it's just the UI. You don't need to have expertise. It's just issuing certificates to entities.
And then do you work with the Hyperledger Fabric SDKs? Or?
There's no need. We have our own SDK that we push out, but we are flexible to actually replace the same SDK that gets pushed out and just change the CA functionality of the fabric.
Follow up on that question top of line. Is that module able to issue these extra 9 certificates now to the end users by integrating with the enterprise or whatever?
100%. That's exactly the scenario. So 2 things happens when it comes to X509. We can give you a regular X509 using any type of algorithm that you have, RSA or ECC. But what we are pushing out for next year, and I'm not in sales, I'm just in R&D, so sales will do a different job when it comes to selling this, but we will push out PQC algorithm. So you could have a hybrid certificate, which will be an RSA, and let's say different type of algorithm like Picnic, or there's a big list of that. So this certificate that you push out could reside for the next 20 years, and it still uses the same technology today and the one that will be available tomorrow. And key management obviously is part of that. Yes?
On all these questions, the CA in Hyperledger Fabric has got some specific attributes and implementation that's tuned to Hyperledger Fabric. So will this regulation also preserve all that?
Absolutely. So the goal has been to keep the requirements exactly the same. Again, we have tested it. For us, it was a couple of scenarios. One is performance needs to be very high. But primarily what we have looked into is how easy it is to actually replace this. Again, it's plug and play. You take it out, you put the new one in, and it should work.
You mentioned that there's quantum Supremacy, and have you started to implement some post-quantum?
Absolutely. Yeah, so we are working on 3 different algorithms right now. We have not submitted any algorithm to NIST. It was about 72 submissions. As of this morning, there are only 62 left. We have worked with Microsoft Research. Picnic is the one that we have worked with. That's based on supersingular mathematics. We have worked with 2 other algorithms, Dilithium and Catalyst. Those are hash-based and code-based. And all those 3 are part of a hybrid certificate that we will soon publish. And they will be available to pick and choose on the platform for Hyperledger as well. Any other questions? Yes.
So you mentioned the certificates. What about the smart contract security permissions that you guys are you guys doing anything in that with DigiCert?
Sure. We are doing dynamic analysis on the smart contracts. So the idea is we are receiving the smart contract that you're putting, could be on Fabric, could be on Ethereum. Specifically, we are working on Ethereum at this point. And what we are doing is doing dynamic and low-level machine analysis, LLVM, on the smart contract to identify that, first of all, does it follow the proper instructions? Second of all, is there any memory leakage that comes out of that contract? And if it is, then we will put that contract on the bottom line of the queue, push it back, ask for it to be fixed, and then we bring it back again. But again, this is just research at this point. There's no product on it.
And the other one you mentioned is dashboard. Does it only integrate with Hyperledger Fabric, or also with the other cloud-based implementations of Fabric management methods?
Right now is only with Hyperledger Fabric. There are other ones that we're working on. Definitely ND will be something that we are interested to work on. The ND scenario is a little bit more different because the idea will be that validating a specific users. You can imagine that a company comes in and they say they have a platform based on ND and you would like to be part of it. But how would I make sure that you are who you are on ND? So what we provide here is a remote onboarding. You can consider that taking an image of your ID, taking an image of yourself. We will make sure with the local entities that this ID is the proper one, and then we will say that this is a valid identity. There's two ways after that. One is using your real name, other one is using an identifier that, again, is a privacy-preserving model that you can add. Yes?
We talked about a little on the issuance of identities itself, having CA development on that. Do you have any thoughts on the actual usage of the identities in smart contract, authentication, validation, using those things in the fabric in some form, either in chain or
Definitely. So identity by itself is quite massive. And one example that I can give you is that academic has done on data sets and not on identity is utilization of fully homomorphic encryptions or homomorphic encryptions. And the idea is doing computation of encrypted data without decrypting them. So we have taken the same idea and we are trying to apply that on the fabric. You're part of an enterprise who's part of the fabric. You're willing to work with the fabric, but you're not willing to show your identity to the fabric. How are we able to do that? In the next following weeks, we'll have some publications in regards to what we have done. There's some IP in place for that. Unfortunately, I can't discuss it before the IP comes out. But again, what we are doing is preserving identities, but preserving valid identities. And that needs to be seamless on the fabric, and that's what we have been working on.
so would that be in the form of a library or something that you...
Exactly, right, yes.
What's that kind of homomorphic encryption do you use? Because generally it's very computational.
Yeah, this is not fully homomorphic encryption. So we don't need to do fully homomorphic encryption because FHE or even homomorphic encryption by itself is just being used for data sets.
Yeah.
We are not dealing with data sets, we are dealing with identities. Yeah, that will make Fabric very slow. You don't want that.
Related to the Silk Road example that you gave, there's a lot of uses for blockchain where even in an anonymous context, just by sort of, you can, in reverse, sort of identify who that person is, or, let's say Amazon starts using it and then everything's shipped to their house, or, everybody's prescriptions on a medical network. So eventually if that asset becomes valuable enough, you can put more effort towards identifying who they are on the blockchain. Do you have any suggestions for this conflict between sort of an anonymous entity that wants to remain anonymous in, say, like a medical context, but then you need to identify, prescription and stuff?
Sure. So one problem there is, think about Amazon as you mentioned. Majority of the time when I buy a product off of Amazon, I go and look at the reviews. And sometimes reviews are fake, like OpenTable back in the US, they had fake reviews. But sometimes they're saying this is a verified user. Well, the verified user is fine, but is there any way for me to actually find out who that verified user is? Indeed. I can do NLP, natural language processing, pick the same review. Google is my best friend in this scenario. Go look for the same language and identify that if this is the same user or no. So now I have gained something, and at the same time I have invaded somebody else's privacy. So technologies such as secure multi-party computation is something could totally be utilized in this scenario, which is I can trust an entity based on the voting of other entities that they have said this person is trusted. And again, this is consensus protocol in some sense. And I can still preserve that privacy. The problem with this is internet is so distributed that we are not able to use this. And our problem with this is problems such as Sybil attack. I could have multiple identities, and then I can go ahead and say, I'm verified, and the other fake identity is verified, and then exponentially start adding this up. This again comes down to how to validate the proper identity. The problem that has not been solved yet is identity validation, adding it to multi-party computation, and then distributing it on the internet. And this is a pretty big work in academia. So I really can't say if there's a solution to it as of right now, but definitely there's work in progress that takes place. Sweet. Well, thank you so much for your time. Have a great time here. Cheers.